Reconvene for Sunday school, please. We are working our way through Jim Neuheiser's book, Marriage, Divorce, and Remarriage. We are in the divorce section, and I've already expressed my trepidation about being able to finish before I go on sabbatical. And so I was tasked with trying to do 3 chapters in 1 week. And I thought, oh my. But then I remembered that a few years ago, I had one of our members here ask me about divorce and specifically addressing the question of the view of permanent marriage, the permanent view on divorce. And I realized I took really good notes when I addressed that person's questions. So what I'm going to do instead of working through the book is work through my own logic on this issue, which is still quite a bit referencing this book. So this is a few years old. None of you have heard this before because it was just for a church member. But I think we won't be able to get through the whole thing, but we'll be able to get through about 2/3 of it, which I think is about as much as I wanted to get done in the first place. Okay, turn to... We need some people to look up various passages again. So who wants to look up Matthew 5:32? Alex Newsom has that one. Okay. Who wants Matthew 19, verse 9? Who wants that one? Linda, thank you. Mariah, do you want to take the next one? It is Mark 10, verses 11 and 12, I think. Yes. And then Luke 16:18. Who wants to do that one? All right, everybody's fighting over it. Elena, you get deference as a lady in our midst. And those are all for now. 16:18. Luke 16:18. Okay. Someone read for us Matthew 19, not verse 9. Who's got the Matthew 19 passage? Linda, is that you? Yes, but I'm one back up. I wanted to read some other verses too. Okay? I want you to read verse 3.
Verse 3?
Mm-hmm.
Some Pharisees approached him, testing him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any grounds?"
So the Pharisees were asking the question because even the Israelites in this day were confused about the proper interpretation of the Old Testament data. Hence, why the Pharisees, the hypocrites among them, came up to Jesus with their question, not only to learn, but more likely to test him. So you and I have to piece together a lot of scriptural data, and that's why there are a number of different views among evangelicals. Interestingly, but intentionally, our confession of faith is silent on the topic of divorce, unlike what we read in the Westminster Confession, which specifically addresses it. And there's reasons for that, but I'm not going to get into that today. So what's our goal today is to try to figure out what the Bible actually wants us to believe, contrary to what the misinterpretations over the centuries and millennia have been. I remember reading the verse in Mark. Who's got that verse? Mark, go ahead and read that one.
And he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery."
I remember thinking that some relatives of mine were committing adultery because they had been divorced. And then I learned about the exception clause later. This is when I was a kid, of course. And then once I got to college, I realized that there are several different positions, and really good men beg to differ with each other on this subject. For instance, John Piper, when I was reading his book in college, it's called Momentary Marriage. He holds to a permanence view. And then in Carlisle, when I was there in Pennsylvania for a couple years, there were at least one, if not two, difficult divorce situations that the elders were wrestling with. What is the biblical position, and how do we best counsel the individuals in these marriage situations? And then also, when I was candidating for a different church in 2015 before coming here, one of the big questions that they asked me, and I think it was because they had a really difficult situation in their church in the past, was about divorce. So I had to really dig in hard and try to figure out what I believed about it. So let me summarize the permanence view first. This is that no divorce is allowed and no remarriage. You are not allowed to divorce, and you are not allowed to remarriage. This has surged in popularity in evangelicals such as John Piper. This is the historic Roman Catholic position. And supposedly, both Jesus and Paul teach this position. And here's what they do. It's the betrothal period is what they have in mind here. They're not saying that the exception clause, except for sexual immorality, applies to marriage, but during the betrothal period, say like Joseph was going to divorce Mary because she had gotten pregnant out of wedlock. And there's an aspect of 1 Corinthians 7 that we're going to get to in a future week, but the permanence view is one that I'm going to rebut, in my view, right now. My view is that divorce is okay if according to the biblical exceptions given, and that if the divorce was under biblical exceptions, then remarriage is also okay. In other words, to quote Neuheiser, sexual sin is such a severe violation of the marriage covenant that it gives the innocent spouse grounds for divorce. The innocent spouse is then also free to remarry a believer and not be in sin for doing so. This is the majority position throughout Protestant history, to be clear, and it's taught right there in the Westminster Confession of Faith, if you want to look it up in the back of our red hymnal. And there are two key sections along with some others, and we're going to look at some of those this morning. All right, so Matthew 19. Did you have that one, Linda? Read verse 9.
I tell you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery.
And then the Mark passage, is that Mariah? Who is the Mark one? Mark 10, 11, and 12? Mm-hmm.
And he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery.
You see the rub. One says it's a blanket statement, a general statement, and the other has an exception. So how do we make sense of these two? The permanent view says that, well, in the eyes of God, even the divorced are still married to God. That doesn't make any sense to me, and that supposedly Jesus still sees the marriage as truly intact, even if they have been divorced in the eyes of the world. But that's not the case, because when you look at these passages, Jesus himself sees the marriage as truly being divorced. Now, we have to clarify that the ideal is for marriage to be for life. But Jesus does not say that he does not say no man can separate what God has joined. He says it should not happen. Let not man separate what God has joined. If there is a divorce, you are no longer married to that spouse. And there's another case in point when we look at the Old Testament from Deuteronomy 24, which we looked at last time. Why couldn't the woman go back to her first husband? Because there was a real marriage and a real divorce that happened there. There's also kind of a eye-opening concept that Jim Neuheiser draws our attention to, which he got from Jay Adams, if you know that name from the biblical counseling world. He said, in the Old Testament, God himself divorces Israel. And it says that. So surely if God divorces Israel in the Old Testament, we can't condemn any and all divorce out of hand. So as I see it, the exception highlights the seriousness of marriage. Think about it. If divorce were not allowed, period, and we talked about this some last week, then a person could be habitually unfaithful to his or her spouse, and the offended spouse could have no choice but to be stuck in the marriage. This, I argue, dilutes and denigrates the seriousness of the marriage covenant. But in giving an exception, Jesus is emphasizing the seriousness of that covenant together, the one flesh union between a man and woman that can be severed because of adulterous activities. For instance, in the Old Testament, what was the penalty for adultery? Does anybody know? Alex Newsom? It was death. It was the death penalty for adultery. So in other words, don't commit adultery or you'll receive the death penalty. That was the Old Testament. They were impaled, Numbers 25. If the consequence for adultery under the Old Covenant was death, now in the New Covenant, the consequence is that the guilty party may be divorced by the innocent spouse. This is also serious because God is saying, I prize and prioritize that marriage covenant to such an extent that it must be held intact and not tainted by adultery. You could say that the new covenant is far more merciful when it comes to marriage and sin than the Old Testament was. One strike and you're out in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, there is an exception for adultery. There can be a divorce and, of course, a remarriage. As I mentioned, that permanence view believes that the exception clause only refers to the betrothal period, like with Joseph and Mary. But that, Neuheiser argues, and I agree, seems to make more of sex than it does of the marriage covenant. Because the marriage covenant hadn't been consummated in the betrothal period, even though they were legally obliged to one another. So why would divorce be allowed prior to consummation when immorality is not as big of a deal since there hadn't been a consummation yet, but yet not allowed in the context of marriage where adultery is a huge deal because there's already been a consummation of marriage? So it seems to me that Jesus is allowing divorce during the betrothal, but he also has in mind divorce in the actual marriage, the consummated period, you would say. If the exception clause only applies to the betrothal period, then why does he bring this up in the discussion of marriage? All these passages that we are reading from here are talking about marriage, not betrothal. So in other words, Jesus has thoughts for us, applications for us for marriage, not just betrothal. For instance, when you look at that Matthew 19 passage, if you haven't yet turned there, the question is not about betrothal divorce, it's just about divorce in general. Verse 3, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any grounds? When Jesus discusses these various texts, and he alludes back to Genesis 1 and 2 and Deuteronomy 24, these are obviously referring clearly to marriage as well. Jesus was condemning the sinful and adulterous actions of the Jews who just simply dropped their wives at the drop of a hat and entered into new marriages. Neuheiser quotes from some old Jewish saying from, I don't know if it's a Talmud or the Mishnah or something like that, and it said that if a wife burns her husband's food, he may divorce her. What do you think? Wives, do you like that? I would think not. That is absolutely ridiculous. They were taking the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law in the Old Testament. And then another question. If Jesus was referring to the betrothal period, why wouldn't he have specified that's the case? Because otherwise, the listeners would have gotten confused. Now, wait a second, Jesus. Are you talking about marriage during the betrothal period? Or are you talking about marriage after consummation and what we can now consider to be marriage? Now, there's another aspect that people tend to point to among the permanence view, and it's that the word for sexual immorality there that you see in the various passages, sexual immorality, verse 9 of chapter 19 of Matthew, is a different word than the word for adultery. I don't like to throw around Greek words in my sermons for obvious reasons, but since we're in Sunday school, I don't mind mentioning the specific Greek words. The word porneia, from which we get pornography, is a general word, a broad word for sexual promiscuity. Things like adultery, incest, even bestiality, homosexuality, and really all sorts of forms of sexual deviance could be included in that word porneia. Meanwhile, the specific word for adultery is moikao. So what I would say is that in the Septuagint, is that even though Jesus uses the general word for porneia, which they would say means that it's referring to the period of betrothal, not that of marriage, I would say no, the Greek Septuagint used them more interchangeably. You can use the word porneia instead of the word moikao, and it's fine. It's a lumping it all together. Any sort of serious sexual sins, all sorts of sexually deviant sins can be cause or grounds for divorce. For instance, in Jeremiah 3, the Lord himself divorced Israel on the grounds of adultery. So if God is allowed to divorce his spouse on account of adultery, why would human beings not be allowed to divorce on the count of adultery? Other examples of divorce include Herod's unlawful marriage to his brother's former wife, Herodias. That's Matthew 14. And it was actually a real divorce, unlike what the permanent view specifies. Okay, so let's harmonize these two accounts. Why does Matthew have the exception clause, but Mark and his gospel account doesn't? Or to phrase it differently, which passage controls the other passage? I think we answer that question by the principle of clarity. Who can elaborate on that for us? What is the principle of clarity?
Passages that are difficult to understand can often be brought into light by other passages.
Yes. The clear passage acts as a guide to the less clear. So what I mean is, the fact that Mark didn't include it in his very general statement doesn't mean that Jesus didn't say it. Mark may be simply recording a different incident. He may just be summarizing, which if you've read the gospel according to Mark and the gospel according to Matthew, Matthew is always longer and Mark is always shorter, at least most of the time. Mark is giving the general rule without the qualification, and that's okay. For instance, don't murder. Sixth commandment. But when is it okay to kill? When is it okay to kill? Okay, death penalty. What else? Alex?
A soldier in war.
War. Do you have one? Okay, self-defense. Yeah. What about anger? Don't be angry. But wait, Jesus was angry. Aha, be angry and do not sin. In other words, there are exceptions to that. What about speeding in a vehicle on a road? That's the law. So why then do emergency vehicles go past the speed limit? Because they're going to rescue someone. They have an exception to it. Mark is not trying to say This controls the other passage. Matthew's clarification controls Mark's passage, explaining away Matthew's more clear account on favor of Mark's less clear account based on cultural assumptions is a bit of a stretch. Now, it's true that Joseph was going to divorce Mary for her presumed immorality before the Lord thankfully intervened, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus had the betrothal period or his own conception and beginning in mind. It simply meant that Jesus was addressing this because his listeners were Jewish and they had a legal obligation, unlike we do, for betrothal. And there's also another reason, and this one's a little dense, but I think some of you will be able to understand what I mean. When you look at Matthew 19:9, read that again for us, Linda.
Yes. I tell you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery.
These phrases, divorces his wife and remarries another woman, are coordinate grammatically. They are structurally and grammatically connected. So you could say it this way. Anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman without immorality being the reason commits adultery. Or to put it differently, whoever divorces and marries another for some reason other than adultery is committing adultery. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another because of adultery is not committing adultery. So that's a little dense logic there, but I think you'll be able to follow that. Okay, I just drove about 80 miles per hour through that topic so that we could be able to finish that for now. What questions do you have about sexual immorality being a ground for divorce and thus remarriage? Is Jesus recommending divorce on the count of sexual immorality? No. If at all possible, maintain the marriage. Don't get divorced. But if you can't, then you may get divorced. Linda?
I have to, devil's advocate.
Oh, boy.
Okay, so if it's not the permanence view, then why did the disciples say, well, if this is what marriage is, then let's just not get married. That's too hard. We can't handle that. Why are they freaking out?
Someone else want to answer a question?
Probably because of what you were talking about with regard to the idea that I could divorce my wife because she's eating my food, or
Yeah.
they were so used to having much more lenient rules surrounding a divorce that the idea that only in this circumstance could I divorce my wife. Because even look at the way that our culture treats divorce now is very flippant, right? I just fell out of love, or my wife and I just don't agree on too many things, or whatever. I don't know. That would be my answer.
Sure. Let's go with that.
I have a second one.
Okay, go for it.
Okay. This is also a larger question I have. If I'm correct, the word wife isn't really our concept of wife. It's just the word for woman. I looked it up in another Bible. It's like one word, and it seems like
Sure.
contextually it's either woman or wife. So I think
Sure.
that could be an argument for the permanence view. It's not really the wife. It's just whoever's the
That's
woman
true.
in this situation.
Gunaikos, right?
Gynae, I think, is what it says.
Gune, yeah. They changed the epsilon to the U. But yeah, that is true. However, contextually, you're talking about divorce. So
Right.
that seems like a bit of a stretch. Yeah. And I don't see any of the permanence view people arguing that either, which means I think they know that that's not a great argument.
Okay, that makes sense.
So we have debunked the devil on two fronts. Okay. Other questions?
Do you know why the 1689 didn't have the divorce section? Because when I
Yes.
taught on the marriage section here, I couldn't figure it out.
I spent about an hour reading on that yesterday.
I had some speculations, but I couldn't really get a hard answer.
Thanks to Alex Lancaster's gifting me Jim Renahan's book on the subject. He had like 4 pages on it, and then I read something else from another section as well. Basically, the reason is this, and this is an oversimplification, but the London framers, which are based on the Savoy Declaration framers of their confession, including John Owen, the Prince of Puritans himself, said that this was a matter for the state, not for the church. Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's what it is. It does not. It does not have a divorce section. Yeah. Allie.
I was just going to say, against the permanence view, the scripture comes to mind that divorce is because of the hardness of your heart.
Yep, that's there. Mm-hmm.
And that's to give the woman the ability to remarry.
Yep.
So she can be taken care of.
Yep.
So I think that's a stronger rebuttal to that.
Yeah, and it was Neuheiser or somebody in there who said that basically what Jesus is saying is that sexual immorality is essentially a death of sorts. And that when that person commits that heinous of a sin, they're basically killing themselves, so to speak. I know that's a bit of hyperbole, but at the same time, you can see the parallel there. The reason that the divorce is allowed is because that person has killed the marriage covenant, so to speak.
Which has greater implications for Israel and God.
There you go.
So the fact that God was just in saying, I'm going to let these people take over because you have committed adultery against me with other gods. And yet he was merciful
Yeah.
and remarried them.
Yeah.
Is there a relationship between this idea that in Jeremiah that God divorces Israel and the opening up of the gospel and salvation to the Gentile world, do you think? Or is that too far of a stretch?
I don't know.
In my mind, I can picture that being too far of a stretch that some liberal pastor would preach on.
Some of that's going to depend on what your hermeneutical system is concerning the relation of the covenants or in relation to the peoples of God. To what extent and how would you define Israel as being the people of God? Is it, as I believe, simply a chosen ethnic people to start the process of a chosen people, capital P, capital C church, to shadow, yes. In which case, it was not God getting another spouse, it was God bringing in all that God had planned. But yeah, that's a great question. I'd have to think some more about that. Other questions? All right, let me pray. Thank you, Father, for giving us the concept of marriage, the thing itself, but then in most of our cases, the gift of marriage in our own lives. Help us to cherish it and treasure it, and like my grandparents, or who are going on 70 years of marriage, pray that you grant us long-lasting, faithful, godly, repenting marriages. In Jesus' name.